Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Seoul and to have an opportunity to talk to such distinguished guests today. Like Joe, I feel it's enormously exciting to be here at a time when the government is charting out a new path towards shared prosperity, and to participate in this extraordinarily well-organized conference in which the papers are all, or the talks are all around the same theme. And I've certainly learned a lot already, and I plan to learn a lot more today. So let me talk from these slides. I want to talk about two questions which were suggested that I think about. One is inequality good or bad for economic growth? And then is the sort of reverse position to that, is growth good or bad for inequality? So what I'm going to argue is that those questions don't make a lot of sense to me in that very simple form. And I don't think they're very helpful for thinking about the extremely important relationship between inequality and growth. Inequality and growth are two outputs of a very complex social and economic system. And the mechanisms that produce both are different in different places. And we have to have a deeper understanding to get some handle on the relationship between the two. So for one thing, inequality is not bad in and of itself. Philosophers have written about this at great length, and I'm certainly persuaded by those who don't think that inequality in and of itself is a bad thing. But I do believe that it can be consequentially bad, meaning that it does bad things to societies, some of which Joe has already talked about, and some of which I'm going to illustrate by example from the United States in part of my talk. So much depends on how it is that the rich get rich, about how the inequality happens. And one way I like to think about it is that there's really two ways of getting rich, of individuals getting rich. One is by making things, which is a creative enterprise, and the other is by taking things, which is essentially theft, which is stealing from other people who have things to bring to yourself. So that making is a good thing, and we'd like to have more of it in all societies. Taking is a bad thing, and that a good objective of public policy, an important objective of public policy, is to stop this theft or rent-seeking. Rent-seeking is a term that Joe used, and which I've certainly used a lot in my recent writing. And I want to return to these two questions about inequality at the end. But keep in mind this distinction between making, a good thing, and taking, which is a bad thing. If you take stuff, you ought to go to jail. If you make stuff, you ought to be rewarded for making it. So let me say a little bit about history, because we're in a difficult time right now. Korea seems to be setting out on a really good path. The United States seems to have determined to set out on a really bad path. And it's very easy to be depressed about the state of the world. But there's something to be said for looking about where we are now compared with the past before we go ahead. So these great, what I call the great, in my book, I've called the Great Escape, are these great episodes of human progress in which humanity moved from destitution, ill health, and premature mortality to what we have in the richer world today, which is long life and high material living standards. And many other good things. There's less violence in the world than there used to be. There's a good deal more democracy, even if democracy is under threat today. and people are living better lives in many aspects, which are not just to do with having more material well-being. There's much less discrimination against minorities, for instance, than there used to be. So progress has often been interrupted. Anyone that looks at the 20th century would be completely insane to say that progress is smooth. Progress is always threatened, sometimes really brutally, but has always resumed. So the nature of these episodes of progress, as I describe in The Great Escape, are that most of them have not brought everybody out of destitution together. Some people escape first. China today is a very good example of that. So many other people at first get left behind, and so that progress in that sense has been an engine of inequality. So China, which is currently one of the most unequal places in the world, is very unequal because it's grown very fast. And so that's one of the reasons it doesn't make sense to say that inequality hampers growth. The consequences of inequality certainly can. Inequality that's created by these episodes is also provides an incentive for the next generation to escape. So in these cases, inequality comes with economic growth and can actually help stimulate economic growth in these circumstances. These are not general theorems that I'm proposing here. The most famous case of progress and inequality is what historians call the Great Divergence. And this is the sustained economic growth which began in Northwest Europe between about 1750 and 1850, if you like, the Industrial Revolution, which sowed the seeds for the increases in material living standards and increases in life expectancies that we all enjoy today. But of course, what it also did was to create an enormous amount of inequality, because at first it was only Britain and Holland and a few other countries that followed in Northwest Europe, leaving the rest of the world behind, or actually harming the rest of the world. And so you got this progress. The Industrial Revolution was an enormous generator of inequality, much of which persists to this day. Now, of course, these gaps that opened up around the time of the Industrial Revolution have changed and in some cases have closed, but they've never consistently closed. So that country by country, gaps in material living standards are still not closing around the world, even if person by person global income inequality is falling. The Industrial Revolution was the beginning of prosperity in the modern world. It created enormous global inequalities that still remain today, yet it seems wholly good. So this is an example of an episode that's the fountainhead of our well-being today, which generated enormous and very persistent inequalities. Even that is probably the best case, because some suffered more than just being left behind. Here's a quote from Robert Allen's recent book on a very short history, The Industrial Revolution. He says that underdeveloped countries in the 20th century were made, not born. They were the products of 19th century globalization and the industrialization of the West. So that there's this famous quote of one of the governors of India who talked about, after the Industrial Revolution, saying the bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. That was the result for Indians of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And of course, not also the Industrial Revolution, but colonialization and all the other evils that came with the Industrial Revolution and with the growth of Northwest Europe. So even then, you've got a mixture of making and taking. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is the beginning of all this making that makes us all better off. On the other hand, it's taking from other places like India, sometimes by force. And of course, the issue that we always have to worry about, and something that I think is relevant for Korea, that the makers often turn into takers. So that those who pioneer the revolutions and get rich and even make other people rich often try to block those who come after, often by force or by lobbying or by enlisting government support or by taking over the government, as Joe talked about. The Industrial Revolution of Britain and India is one of the examples that I've just given you. They also tried to suppress competition, for instance, by having, when you've got an invention, you get a patent, you try to make the patent last longer to keep new entrants out, to have non-compete clauses, to consolidate with other firms, to undermine competition so that the benefits that came to you are not extended to the next generation of people. So, of course, this requires vigilant regulation and constant enforcement, and because benefiting society in round one does not entitle monopolistic exploitation in round two. And of course, inventions can also spread and benefit others. Let me, before I talk about some of the horrible things that are happening in the US today, let me talk a little bit about the last 50 years of progress in the world. This is a graph I like to call the onward and upward graph. This picture shows GDP per head in price-adjusted dollars on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis it shows life expectancy at birth. The circles are, the areas of the circles are proportional to the population of the countries. So the big countries in the middle are India and China, and the big country in the top right is the United States. There are two periods shown here, one in light gray, which is 1960, and one in dark gray, which is 2010, 50 years later. And what you can see is, first of all, this very strong association between income per head and health as measured by life expectancy at birth. You can also see that over time, the world has been moving up the curve, and the curve itself has actually moved upwards too. So that there's progress through increasing material living standards, but there are also progress conditional on material living standards of getting better health. So that you can see, for instance, there are many countries in Africa that have longer life expectancy now than they would have had 50 years ago, given their income levels. The arrow just shows the onward and upward direction. The world is getting to be a better place. Not only is there increasing material prosperity, but there's increasing longevity to enjoy that material prosperity. You want to see where Korea is. Here's the same graph with Korea in 1950 and Korea in 2010. As the president referred to, there's been this enormous increase in prosperity in Korea. It's sort of world record jump. I often draw this curve for other countries over the two periods, and I often put Korea on there to show other countries what is possible and how no one has done as well as Korea over this period, and this enormous increase in life expectancy. You can see that I didn't quite make the 30,000 on this graph because it's drawn for 2010, not 2020, but I'm pretty close. I'm glad to see that I didn't make a mistake there. You can also see the United States as the big black blob at the top, and it's below the line. I mean, in that it's doing much worse than you would expect it to do in life expectancy, given its position in the world. So this catch-up growth, which Korea and China and other countries have benefited from, can be much faster than original growth. And the same is true for human health. So the germ theory of disease, which was developed in Europe at the end of the 19th century, has been the basis for enormous improvements of health worldwide. And here's one of my favorite statistics. Between 1896 and 1996, over that 100-year period, Korean women grew by 20.2 centimeters, from 142 centimeters to 162 centimeters on average. That is the world record for sustained growth in height. In many countries around the world that have done well, it's about 1 centimeter per decade. Here you've got a century at 2 centimeters per decade. So like many things in Korea, there's just this awesome, extraordinary progress. And this increasing health of women has, I suspect, a lot to do with Korea's economic success. Here's some famous pictures about the number of people in global poverty, and this is always worth looking at when you're worried about globalization and the state of the world. We started in 1980 with more than 2 billion people. These are millions, so it's 2,000 million people in dollar a day poverty, or whatever the current measure is. And you can see that that number has decreased to actually, it's around 1 billion here. If I were to update that, the latest numbers are about 700 million people in global poverty. It's still a tragedy that there's 750 million people living in destitution in the world. But it's always important whenever you think about globalization and the state of the world to keep this graph in mind, because this reduction in poverty from 2 billion to under 1 billion in 30 years is completely unprecedented in the history of humanity. And much that would not have happened without globalization, without the liberal world order after the Second World War. Many people say it's just China, but that's not true. As you can see from the blue line in the middle, where even if you take China out, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of poverty reduction. Other countries around the world, and even sub-Saharan Africa, which has done the worst, is flat or beginning to turn around. I want to talk now about something that Joe referred to as the work that I've been doing with my colleague Ann Case at Princeton. And I'm going to set this up. I want to show you the facts first. But I think of this as an illustration of what happens if Joe called America a failed model, a failed set of policies. This is what happens when the takers are in control, when you have unconstrained ability for the rich, for the takers, to control what happens to ordinary people. And this is about within-country inequality, of course. So let me start by, in sort of preface, this is a picture of, for white men and women in the United States in middle age, between 45 and 54, and it shows their mortality rate. This is the fraction of people in that group who die in any given year. It shows the mortality rate throughout the 20th century from 1900 to 2000. These are all measured, and the other graphs you'll see are all measured out of deaths per 100,000. So the left-hand figure is 1,400 out of 100,000, and the right-hand figure is about 400. So remember that 400 for the next graph. But of course, what you've got here is a century of extraordinary progress in reducing mortality in midlife. And you could see this for other age groups too. The big spike around just before 1920 is the influenza epidemic at the end of the First World War. And there's a flat patch around 1960, which is the result of smoking beginning to take its toll in mortality. But otherwise, you've got this immense progress from 1,400 down to 400 over just a 100-year period. So now I want to show you what happened after 2000. Now, you could draw graphs like this for other countries too, and they would, in the 20th century, look like the ones I've just shown you. And I want to show you from 1900 through to 2010 or so, all-cause mortality for a bunch of other countries. So there's France, Germany, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Sweden. And you can see that they're declining from around 400, which is the figure you saw at the end of the American story, down to what they have today, which is it's different in different countries, but there's been this steady decline of about 2% a year. That's health progress for you in midlife in other countries. So what happens? Those are the countries that have different economic policies than much of the US does. If you put the US on top of that, I'm going to show you whites in the red line, which is what I showed you before, and Hispanics in a heavy blue line. And what you get is this astonishing picture, that all of a sudden the US, which has been declining at 2% a year like every other country, for whites in the US, it just stops declining and starts going up. This is just something that you know, when Ann Case and I first drew this picture, we really thought we must have made a mistake because mortality rates do not go up for prolonged periods of time. They don't even stop falling for prolonged periods of time. And you get this astonishing turnaround. For US Hispanics, which is the blue line, you can see that they went on doing what they've been doing all along. They're not problematic. Let me show you something about African Americans. Hispanics is the blue line, the light blue line at the bottom of this graph, and you see the declining mortality. White non-Hispanics are the rising heavy blue line in the middle. And then on top, you can see black non-Hispanics, and you can see that this is a group that over this period since 1998 through to 2015 has had fairly rapidly declining mortality rate. The red line is a group I'm going to talk about a bit more, which is white non-Hispanics without a BA, or in fact, that's white non-Hispanics with a high school degree or less, sort of not the least educated, but the people who have a high school degree but no more education than that. And you can see this extraordinary thing. These demographics don't change very rapidly. But if you take all African Americans who've always been the worst group in America for mortality or other outcomes, they were 15% higher than less educated whites in 1998 and are now 15% lower than less educated whites in 2015. So there's been a real reversal of fortunes that in some sense African Americans, which have always been the group in America that's done worst on almost all outcomes, are being replaced by the less educated whites, if you like, the white working class, who are the new group that's doing really badly indeed. So we've called these deaths of despair, and what is rising most rapidly are suicides, alcoholic liver disease from people abusing alcohol, and accidental or intent undetermined drug poisoning, which is basically mortality from drug overdoses. And it's these three groups that have been rising most rapidly. It's not just in middle age either. Here shows other age groups, and you can see rapid increases for those suicide, for deaths of despair among other groups, other age groups in America. And here's a map which shows in 2000 and 2014 all-cause mortality for people in midlife. Darker color is bad, and you can see how much worse things are getting over that 14-year period in the United States, with places that were previously exempt now becoming dark brown and very high mortality rates. So here is a key picture here, which is going to lead me back to my story about why this is happening, which is that this is a division now between men and women. The blue line is men, the red one is women, and the lines on top are the people with a high school education or less, and the people on the bottom are people with a BA or more. So the key distinction here is that these deaths of despair, the increase, they're lower for women than for men, but they're rising for men and women at essentially the same rate. And the bottom shows that this is, it's not, there's been summarized there too, but these are deaths of despair among people with a BA, without a BA, with a high school degree or less, whereas people, if you like, the educated elite, the people who are doing relatively well, are the people who are not experiencing this at all. It's essentially stratified on education. Let me skip that. I want to spend a minute on this because it's important for what else I'm going to say. Start on the left-hand side of this picture. These pictures show birth cohorts. So every little line here shows a group of people who were born in a specific year. So the ones at the bottom right here were born in like 1940, and you track them through for 15 or 20 years. The next group were born in, I think, 1945. I can't really see this, 1950, 1960. And what you can see on the left-hand curve, which is for the people who do not have a BA, these graphs are moving upwards. And these are graphs of deaths of despair. So for each younger cohort, there are more of them die. And as they grow older, the rate at which deaths go up are increasing more and more rapidly. So every cohort is getting worse and worse and worse. The younger cohorts are even worse than their parents, who were worse than the generation before, and so on. And if you look at the people who have a BA or more on the right, there's none of this. These deaths of despair sort of naturally rise with age, suicide rises with age, and so on. And there's no pathology here. But on the left, you see this terrible thing that's happening for these younger cohorts. The world is really coming apart, and these deaths of despair are becoming higher and getting worse with age. Just to show you another link in the chain, these show sciatic pain, self-reported sciatic pain, and the patterns with age. And you can see the same thing is happening here. If you have a BA or more on the right, there's a rise in pain with age, which is, you know, we all get more aches and pains as we get older. But there's no cohort effects, whereas on the left-hand side, these younger cohorts, the people who do not have a BA, are having higher and higher and higher pain levels and higher increase in pain levels as they get older. For some reason, their worlds are getting worse. So what's happening here? Well, Joe talked about stagnation of incomes, but I'm going to show you something even worse here. These are cohort pictures, and they show median real wages for white non-Hispanic men with less than a BA by birth cohort. And really all you have to do focus on here is that big blue arrow going down, which is if you don't have a BA in the US labor market, your lifetime profile of wages is lower for each cohort than it was in the previous cohort. And the shape of it is changing too, but I don't have time to talk about that. But you can see that the wage profiles are sort of getting steadily worse for those, for every younger cohort. If you take people with a BA, the arrow reverses, and their earnings profiles are moving up over time with each successive birth cohort. These are 5 years apart, each cohort actually doing better than the previous one. So there's this total division about whether you have a BA or whether you don't have a BA. For people without a BA, wages are getting steadily worse. For people with a BA, wages are getting steadily better. So there's a large group of people, white men and white women, without a university degree who've been left behind. Their opportunities in the labor market have not improved for 40 years. They've actually worsened. And here are some other things that I don't have time to show you, but their labor force participation has markedly declined, which has not happened for people with a BA. Their marriage rates have declined very sharply. Cohabitation has risen. These people are still getting together with their girlfriends or boyfriends. They're having children, but they're not getting married. And these cohabitations are very unstable. So you get these men in middle age who don't know their own children because they're living with other women. There's been a big decline in church participation too. And so that we just don't see this in Europe, though you see some of the political effects which are similar. But it's both wrong and dangerous to leave people behind when other people, when the educated elite are doing well. So I want to come back to the original questions which we started. So how is inequality implicated in this? It's really just too simple to say that inequality is causing these deaths of despair. What I think is causing the deaths of despair is the destruction of the lives of working class people in America. The lives they had 50 years ago are no longer available to them. The social structure, the religious structure, everything else, the personal relationships that went with those have basically been destroyed. And they've been destroyed basically by rent-seeking from above, by a switch of income and power from the ordinary people towards rent-seeking, corruption, crony capitalism. So the low and falling wages of working people are really the key thing here. You can't really blame this on globalization and technical change because there are other countries around the world. Globalization and technical change is also happening in Germany. It's happening in Denmark. It happens everywhere. So the big issue here is the policy in America and the failure of American capitalism and democracy to provide for less educated Americans. Now, you could say, well, everybody needs to get educated. Well, that would be great. But I would very much resist the idea that we have no place in society for people who do not have a BA degree. So government and rent-seeking corporations are increasingly running the economy to redistribute income upwards. And so it's not the inequality that's doing it, but the low wages that are that are enriching the educated minority. And that rent-seeking is actually generating inequality at the same time. So what you've got is a process in which the educated elite, the rich, are plundering the poor. They're destroying their lives and creating inequality at the same time. And that's the story that we're really trying to tell here. I could talk about some of the mechanisms. We have, one of the things you don't have here, and one of the worst things we have in America, is a totally insane healthcare system which spends or wastes about $1 trillion a year, which is $8,000 for every family per year, which comes out of wages and profits and everything else, and is really part of the reason that we're really forcing down wages. There's also a whole list of policies which are very hostile to labor in the US. There's been almost elimination of private sector unions, increasingly virulent attacks on public sector unions. Unions helped keep up wages. They're not really there anymore. They provided a roadway into local and national politics for many politicians in Europe and in the United States. And there was a lot of local social capital. There are many towns in America where social life was organized around the union. A huge amount of that is gone. The declining minimum wage in real terms has been very important here, and the declining political power of labor relative to corporations. We also have a very limited social safety net compared with Europe. One of the things that's worth thinking about is Europe has a value-added tax. A value-added tax, of course, is regressive on the way it's collected, but it's very progressive in the way it's spent because it essentially funds a much richer social safety net than we have in the United States. There's a lot of argument, too, that the increasing degree of consolidation of monopoly, monopsony among many industries in the US has led to increasing markups. Increasing markups, of course, makes some people rich at the price of the people who have to pay for things, and it's another mechanism for redistributing upwards. Some have argued that financial holding companies may be acting like trusts, supporting less competition. There's certainly a very large decline in the number of startups over the long run, perhaps as a result of this increasing competition. And in the latest surveys, more than 2/3 of less educated people in the United States believe that it's pointless to vote because elections are controlled by corporations and by the rich. And the empirical evidence by political scientists suggests that they're right, that it is pointless to vote because they don't get any benefits out of voting. So I'm running out of time. I would argue against the way to deal with this is by having much higher taxes on the rich. Because if you think of this as rent-seeking and theft, the best way to deal with it is to stop it. When people steal, we don't tax them. When people steal, we put them in jail and tell them to stop stealing things. So we need to change the social contract, if you like. We need to change the way that elections are funded. We need to change the way Congress is elected in ways that take the influence of money out of politics in a way that is seen as its most extreme in the United States. So for me, the key is to directly tackle rent-seeking, crony capitalism, and corruption. And that requires a bunch of obvious policies, which is a much more serious revival of antitrust than we've had in the United States in recent years, including monopsony, which is illegal like monopoly, but is very rarely prosecuted. One thing that's worth noting, and we'll probably talk about it again during the discussion this afternoon, is that if there's a lot of monopsony in the system, raising minimum wages may not create very much unemployment, because all that it does is take some of the profits away from the monopsonists and gives them to labor, and people don't necessarily lose their jobs. But anti-competitive practices have redistributed income away from workers through monopolistic pricing, non-compete clauses, compulsory arbitration, and a host of other things. So there's a bunch of policies there, many of which appeal across the political spectrum, because many of them are basically things that are corrupting free market capitalism. So people who really believe in free market capitalism are in favor of regulating monopoly, for example, and that's common ground, or ought to be common ground, in which it's possible to forge policies. So in conclusion, there's nothing wrong with being rich. Indeed, it would be wonderful if everybody was rich. The problem is when the rich get rich by plundering the poor, or where we have institutions that allow that, they generate vast inequalities and they destroy lives. And the remedy is to stop this plunder. And there's a menu of policy choices for doing that. I'm actually finished, so I want to show you one last quote. And I wonder whether anyone here can guess who wrote this. This is about monopoly, monopsony, rent-seeking, and death. It says, the cruelest of our revenue laws, meaning the cruelest of our tax laws, I will venture to affirm, are mild and gentle in comparison of some of those which the glamour of our merchants and manufacturers has extorted from the legislature for the support of their own absurd and oppressive monopolies. Like the laws of Draco, these laws may be said to be all written in blood, which is a wonderful precursor of the idea that rent-seeking through legislatures is threatening to life itself. I don't know how many people know who Draco was. Draco was an Athenian legislator who wrote a code of laws, one of the first code of laws, written code of laws. And it had very simple, which is that you died, you were punished with death for any infraction, however minor. So the laws of Draco, the word draconian in English comes from that. So the person who wrote that is Adam Smith. That comes from The Wealth of Nations. And as Joe said, Adam Smith was writing at a time when modern capitalism was only really beginning, but he understood very well the role of rent-seeking and what rent-seeking could do to destroy people's lives. Don't let it happen here. Thank you very much.
네, 불평등을 어떻게 봐야 하는지에 대한 시각과 또 이를 해결할 수 있는 방안을 제시해준 강연이었습니다. 네, 앵거스 디턴 교수님은 소비와 복지, 빈곤의 관계 등을 규명하는 데 기여하셨으며 개인의 선택과 소득 총액을 연결시킴으로써 경제를 발전시킨 분입니다. 교수님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.